Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jonathan. So our guest speaker today, for session four. Okay, for session four, is going to be a bit later. He's at his residency right now. So for right now, David is going to start us off with a workshop.
Yes. Okay. So I'll drop a link to the workshop that we're doing today in the chat. So if you've read our program schedule, you know that we're doing our neuroscience workshop today, which I'm a personal favorite of. And yeah, like Jonathan mentioned, our guest speaker is in his residency in orthopedic surgery. He can't come until 6. So all we're doing today is flipping the order. We'll do our workshop first, and then our guest speaker shadowing will be afterwards. So nothing else has changed. I put the link to my workshop in the chat. So if you want to download it, if you want to annotate it for any, like if you want to take notes or anything, feel free to do that now. And then we'll go ahead and get started in a second. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'll put my presentation in the chat again for anyone that missed it or joined after I sent it. So you can feel free to open that up and download it if you want to. And then we'll get started. Okay, so good afternoon, good evening, wherever you all are. Thank you so much for coming to our fourth session for our summer program. We're super excited to have you with us. And today we're going to be doing our neuroscience workshop. Like I said, I'm personally a fan favorite of this one because I just graduated with my bachelor's in science and I majored in neuroscience and I've always really, really loved it. So I like getting to teach this workshop to all of you. But first, I know that we mentioned that we'd talk about who were our top debaters from our debate that we had last session. Again, it was a really great conversation and everyone did a fantastic job. So in our eyes, you're all the top debaters. But for our national participants, these were all the top debaters that we have from all of our breakout rooms. We're waiting on a few more from breakout room 3. So if you were in Trisha's breakout room, we're still waiting on a couple more people from her room. But congratulations to everyone that prepared their arguments really well and stood out to us. But again, you all did a great job, so congrats. Okay, so we're going to be talking about our nervous system today. So does anybody know what makes up our nervous system? You can raise your hand, you can drop it in the chat, whatever works best for you. But what is our nervous system made up of? It's okay if you don't know, but if you do know, feel free to let me know. Yeah, I see a couple people in the chat saying brain, neurons, the brain and spinal cord, neurons, brain, spine, nerves. Yes, exactly. Everyone's on the right path. And you're all getting it right. Exactly. That's essentially what our nervous system is comprised of. It's our brain, it's our spinal cord, it's our peripheral nerves, and our sensory receptors. So for our brain here, we have our spinal cord that kind of descends from the brain and goes kind of all the way down your midsection. Then we also have these peripheral nerves that are less talked about. I don't think I saw a lot of people mention peripheral nerves when I don't think I saw a lot of people mention that in the chat, but these peripheral nerves are actually really important because they project off of your spinal cord and they're essentially what lead to they're essentially responsible for allowing us to take information from our environment in, process it, and then make decisions off of that. So for example, if you touch something hot, you feel the sensation of it being hot because of your peripheral nerves and your sensory receptors. So those are also really important. So this is what our nervous system looks like. You can see the brain, the spinal cord, and these peripheral nerves that I was talking about. So you can take a sec to look at this diagram. And then if you just Google like nervous system diagram, you'll be able to see all of this there anyways as well. So does anybody know what the difference is between the CNS and the PNS? I'll spell it out. So it's our central nervous system and our peripheral nervous system. You can tell me a functional difference, an anatomical difference, whatever you know, I'm happy to take. And I'll give people a sec to write it in the chat. Okay, some people are saying your central nervous system is your brain and your spinal cord. Your peripheral nervous system has the nerves from the rest of your body. Yeah, this is all really good inputs. Peripheral nervous system carries messages. Yeah, that's good. That's right. Brain, spinal cord, PNS, all other nerves. Great. I'm seeing lots of great input from the chat. So yes, you're pretty much all right. So our central nervous system consists of our brain and our spinal cord. So it's this integration and command center. It receives all this information from our environment, and it also generates its own information, and it's responsible for making these decisions. It kind of integrates all of this information into memories, into things that we can encode and stuff like that. So that's what our central nervous system is responsible for. We also have our peripheral nervous system. So that's kind of made up of these peripheral nerves that I was talking about earlier and these sensory receptors. They're not just in your hands, but I use them most easily when I'm presenting. So we have that, and they carry messages to and from your spinal cord and the brain. So this is what it looks like here. So in pink, you have your central nervous system, and in blue, you have your peripheral nervous system. So we've gone over the brief anatomy of the nervous system. Of course, there's so much more that we won't have time to get into today, but that's kind of the basic overview of what our nervous system looks like and some of the major components. But why is our nervous system important? Why do we spend the time to study it? And why do universities, offer it as a major even? What makes the nervous system so important that we spend so much time studying it if we want? Okay, someone says it causes all the actions we do, all the things, even if we don't feel inside of us. Yeah, it's our command center. It controls the body. Someone else says, yep, it's also a good point. It's required for most body processes, yes, such as breathing and digestion. Those are two really, really important processes that our brain is directly involved in. Yeah, another thing, less physical, or still physical, but less about sensation. It controls all the organs, so things that you don't even see happening. It helps us understand the connection between thoughts and feelings. So yes, so there's this concept of the brain physically, and then there's also the concept of the mind, which is connected to what our brain and our nervous system looks like physically. And that's a whole other area of science as well that we'll touch on briefly. Yeah, and controls our language, movement. Yes, this is all really great input. So I'll briefly touch on some of the different divisions of the nervous system. So we talked about our central nervous system and our peripheral nervous system, and these are some of the really important things that they do. So for your peripheral nervous system, it's controlling your voluntary muscles and it's transmitting this information to the central nervous system. So for me, I'm talking right now, and in order to talk, I need to have muscles in my face that allow me to talk. And I'm a big hand talker, so I use my hands a lot when I talk, and that's all made possible because of my somatic nervous system and my peripheral nervous system. There are some things that aren't explicitly in our voluntary control, though, like your autonomic nervous system. So, for example, if you have to public speak, or if you have a really big test and you feel really nervous, your heart is racing, you feel kind of sweaty, you feel really anxious, that's your autonomic nervous system essentially preparing you for battle, even though you're not actually going into war. It kind of prepares you the same way. It's responsible for your fight or flight response. So that's another thing that's really important. And then we also have our parasympathetic nervous system. So that's what's calming us down. So think of how you kind of feel a little bit tired after you eat a big meal sometimes. And that's because your parasympathetic nervous system is activated to kind of calm your body and conserve and maintain energy. So it's known as kind of like the rest and digest nervous system. So these are some other functions of the nervous system. Some of you already mentioned this, but it's controlling our ability to move, to think, to breathe. And it also is responsible for our reflexes. So if you've ever touched a really, really hot pan and you immediately jerked away before you even realized that it was hot, it's because of your reflexes. Normally, when you touch something, that information gets transmitted from your sensory receptors through your peripheral nerves to your spinal cord, then to your brain, then to your parietal lobe, where it's processing this touch. But for reflexes, when you touch something that's really hot, that information actually only goes to your spinal cord and then goes right back out so you know to jerk your hand away. Why is it really important for reflexes that it only goes to your spinal cord and not to your brain? Why might that be helpful if you're touching something that's really hot? Yeah, someone says the distance is shorter. Exactly. So if the distance is shorter, that means you can react quicker, potentially burning yourself less. So that's why we have reflexes. Very important for us. Yeah, so we mentioned some of this. And another really fun fact about the nervous system is that your brain contains nearly 100 billion neurons. It's a lot of neurons. So does anybody know, do we keep growing neurons as we get older, or are we kind of born with all of the neurons that we'll have for the most part? Not entirely. Anybody know? Yeah, exactly. You are pretty much born with all of the neurons that you'll ever have. Of course, there are some areas of your brain that have a higher capacity for this process that we call neurogenesis, which means this ability for neurons to be generated. But you don't, nervous system cells like neurons, they don't undergo mitosis, so they don't split, they don't reproduce, they don't divide. So they're kind of there, which is why it's important that we keep our brains healthy so we can keep them functioning well. We got to take care of our brain. And another really cool feature of our nervous system is that it's very highly plastic. So what we mean when we say that our brain is super plastic is that when you do something new, like if you create a new piece of art or you write a new song or you learn something new or you figure out how to use something new, if you're going to a new school and you have to figure out how to get to your new school, so you're exploring a different part of your town, that's rewiring neural networks in your brain based on this experience. And the more you go to your new school, the more you create new art pieces, the faster you'll be at doing those things. It's essentially rewiring your brain to get better at it. And it also shows the influences of the environment on your brain and your nervous system. Okay, I'll look at the chat quickly to see if anyone has any questions. What can cause neurons to die? That's a really good question. We're actually going to talk about some things that contribute to neuronal death later on, but yes, we keep that there. Okay, so we've talked about the major functions of our nervous system overall, and then some components. So let's dig in a little bit deeper and let's go a little bit more specifically. So just looking at our brain in specific, there are a couple different lobes of the brain. Does anybody know what any of the lobes of the brain are? They're separated both anatomically and by function. So each lobe that you see here has a different function, a different main function. They overall do similar things. But does anyone want to give me what any of the lobes are? Amazing.
Can I say it?
Yeah, sure.
The first one is frontal lobe, and then the back is occipital lobe, and then we have parietal. I'm not. I don't think I'm saying it right.
Parietal, yes, but very close.
Yes, parietal lobes, and then the occipital lobe it does with vision, and then frontal lobe is is the one for higher order that's responsible for everything, and then we have temporal lobe, and then in the bottom it's cerebellum.
Awesome. Yes, so you pretty much got all of them. So we have our frontal lobe at the beginning, and I'm also seeing this a lot in the chat as well. Everyone's getting this right. So we have our frontal lobe. Then in pink we have our parietal lobe. In yellow we have our temporal lobe, which I don't know if anyone said that. And then in green we have our occipital lobe, and then not specifically mentioned, but in red we have our cerebellum. I also saw this really interesting question in the chat. About how burns can essentially kill your neurons. That's actually true. If you, depending on the severity of your burn, let's say you get a third-degree burn, which essentially uh, just like chars your skin right down to the bone, that would require a nerve graft. So what a nerve graft is a doctor will essentially take nerve from another part of your body and regraft it onto the site of injury to try to get the neurons to regrow there, because a third degree burn essentially kills all the neurons that were there and you won't regain feeling there unless you perform what is called a nerve graft. So these are the different functions of the brain. I think some people already touched on this already in the chat as well as the participating. So our frontal lobe, it has our primary motor cortex. So all this voluntary motor actions that we were talking about, that's all made possible by our primary motor cortex. We also have our cerebellum that's responsible for some motor actions like walking, but our frontal lobe takes care of most of it. There are some deeper brain structures that also deal with movement, but we won't talk about that today. Then we have our parietal lobe, which contains our somatosensory cortex. So it's integrating all this information, the sensory information from our skin, from our taste, and all of that stuff. Then we have our temporal lobe. So this is where we have our primary auditory cortex. So this is where all of this information about sound is getting processed. And then we have our occipital lobe, like someone mentioned, it's where our primary visual cortex is. And that's where we figure out, what different colors look like and what different shapes look like. And that's where that information is stored. Someone else asked in the chat, can the neurons die if not enough nutrients are supplied in the blood-brain barrier by the astrocytes? So astrocytes aren't responsible themselves for supplying nutrients. That's what the cerebrospinal fluid is there for. It's there to provide nutrients for the brain to keep it happy and healthy. We won't be talking about this, but there's also neurotrophic factors that are released by neurons that help them stay alive. But neurons will die if they don't get that stuff. So yes and no. Someone else asked, is it true that our brain's floating around in our heads and that there are tons of small holes in our skulls to deal with the pressure and weight? I can't speak to the tons of small holes in our skull, but your brain is essentially floating around in this cerebral spinal fluid. Your spinal cord is also kind of floating around in it. That's why when athletes have concussions or when just people have concussions, it's essentially because the brain is moving so fast that it goes through the fluid and it hits your skull. But in normal activities, even if I'm just moving my head around like this, my brain isn't bouncing around in my skull because that fluid is there providing that buoyancy and that cushioning. Okay, so we've talked about the brain. Now let's dig in even deeper and go a little bit more specific and talk about the cells of the nervous system. So we're going from brain, this is tissue, now we're going to cells. So we're going really, really small. So there are two major types of cells in the nervous system. We have our neurons. These are the brain cells that you're going to hear about the most. These are our excitable cells that are transmitting electrical signals. Then we also have our glia. So our glia are cells that support our neurons. Does anybody know, do we have more neurons in our nervous system, or do we have more glia? So which one do we have more of? Do we have more glia or do we have more neurons? Yeah, we have more glial cells. Does anybody know how many more glial cells we have in comparison to our neurons, so like a ratio? So it's about 10 to 1. So we have about 10 times more glia than we have neurons. It's somewhere between 5 to 10 times as many neurons. So however many neurons we have, which is about 100 billion, 5 to 10 times that approximately. We don't know exactly for sure, but that's the estimate. Okay, so we'll talk about neurons first, and then we'll talk about glia. So if you look at this neuron here, doesn't really look like the other cells you might have learned about in school. It looks different, and it also, because it looks different, it also functions differently, right? Like I don't think I know of any other cells that look exactly like a neuron, although there are some spiny cells that look kind of like this. Neurons are super unique. So if you look here, all the way to the left, you see these kind of processes that are extending out of our cell body, which is our soma. So those are our dendrites. So think of our dendrites as these processes that are just waiting to receive information from other neurons and other parts of your brain, other parts of your body. They're waiting here to receive information. Once they receive that information, do you notice how all of these dendrites all connect to the soma or the cell body? They're interchangeable. Once the soma or the cell body receives all of that information from these dendrites that are picking up this information from other neurons, it essentially integrates. And if there's enough integration, the neuron will depolarize and generate an action potential, which I'll talk about in a second. And that action potential is responsible for all of the communication that happens in the nervous system. So that action potential happens and it travels down this axon here, and then the information gets released to the next neuron. So you can kind of think of it like a relay chain. So one neuron's getting this information, it becomes depolarized so that it can send the information on to the next neuron in its track. It's a little bit oversimplified, but we'll talk about it more in a sec. So that's what our neurons look like. Then we also have astrocytes, which also kind of have spiny processes, but they're not as highly detailed. So they're super abundant and they help form our blood-brain barrier. So our blood-brain barrier is essentially this kind of lining of really tightly packed endothelial cells that restrict what comes into the brain. So this is really good because you don't want bad substances entering the brain and potentially harming your brain tissue. But that's also bad because what if someone needs to deliver a treatment to the brain, but the blood-brain barrier rejects it because it thinks it's a foreign substance? So that's why scientists have been kind of working for decades to overcome the blood-brain barrier, to use really, really small molecules that have the treatment or drugs inside of them to deliver it to the brain to kind of sneak past the blood-brain barrier. But it is pretty difficult because it's a very tightly packed system, so it's hard to get stuff in there. Okay, so if you noticed in the picture of the neuron that I had here, there are these little yellow, I guess, processes that are kind of attached to the neuron here, and that's called myelin. So myelin is this fatty substance that wraps around the neuron. You can kind of think of it like a winter coat. It's insulating the neuron. It's not keeping it warm, but it's keeping, you can think of it as keeping all of this charge in. So that's what our myelin looks like on the neuron. And there are cells that are responsible for adding this myelin to the neurons. So we have oligodendrocytes, and they add myelin to neurons in what? Does anyone want to say? So you have
Is it
oligodendrocytes.
is it CNS?
Yeah, exactly. So the oligodendrocytes myelin axons in our central nervous system. And then we have Schwann cells that also myelinate axons, but they do it in our peripheral nervous system. So we talked a little bit about what makes neurons unique. They have this really specialized function. They're electrically excitable, which allows them to communicate information with other neurons. And now we'll talk about myelin specifically. So like I mentioned, it forms this insulating layer around the axon. So you think of this axon as something that charge needs to travel down. This charge needs to travel down, and it needs to stay depolarized and stay excited. So that way, by the time it reaches the end of the neuron, there's still enough left for the neuron to send information to the next neuron. We don't want to lose the charge and potentially risk losing that information from being transmitted. So that's what our myelin is responsible for. And in order for a neuron to send information, it has to get depolarized. So when it gets depolarized, this myelin here essentially helps protect the charge. It protects that positive charge that's coming through to make sure that we can get that information out to the next neuron. So you can see here are these little arrows in the top, and that's essentially representing what the charge does. So the positive charge just jumps between these little spots called our nodes of von Wiehe, which are essentially just tiny little spots where we have receptors but no myelin. And because it can jump like that the charge actually moves a lot faster than it would without the myelin. So if you look at the bottom, you can see all these spaces where the positive charge can just leak out of the node. So with this myelin, it gets more protected, and it's also faster. So it's really important. Someone asked, does repolarization occur at the end of the dendrites? So at the end of our dendrites, that's not where repolarization occurs because the dendrites are receiving information. But at the end of our axons, at our terminal boutons, that's where repolarization happens. And we can talk about that more later. So this is what it looks like kind of up close. You can see that the positive charge is jumping and it's moving a lot faster than if it just has to diffuse all the way down this neuron. And now I'll briefly talk about resting membrane potential. So I'm aware that people are coming into this workshop with different levels of knowledge about biology and resting potentials. So I'm going to try to make this as friendly to everyone's education levels as possible. But if at any point you need me to explain anything more, you're more than welcome to let me know. So the whole point of why neurons are special, well, there are a couple of things, but one of the major things is that it's electrically excitable, like I was talking about. I've been talking about the fact that our neurons can kind of propagate this charge and send this charge down its axon to communicate information with other neurons. But what allows it to have this charge? What makes the neuron able to even send this charge in the first place? Well, it's because of this resting membrane potential. So at rest, you can think of neurons as being super negative. So neurons essentially have a resting membrane potential of negative 65 to negative 70 millivolts. So it's pretty negative. Once these dendrites receive information, Sometimes it'll excite the neuron, sometimes it won't excite the neuron. We won't talk about that today. Let's just say the dendrites are receiving information and it's depolarizing the neuron. That means there's this huge influx of positive charge coming in because when it's depolarized, it allows for positive ions like sodium to come in and depolarize it, making it super positive now, as opposed to being super negative. So if you look at this graph right here, you can kind of see here, we start off at negative 65 millivolts, nothing's really happening, but then these dendrites receive this information and then our sodium channels open, which allows for sodium to come in. Sodium is a positively charged ion, so it's raising our membrane potential. So now our membrane potential has gone from negative 65 to like positive 40 millivolts, and then it kind of stays there for a little bit, and then we start to lose our positive ions and it kind of balances itself out. But the most important part of this is that the neurons are able to become depolarized. And during this depolarization, this charge is traveling down the axon. It's jumping from node to node. And then at the synapse, which is where our axon terminal boutons are meeting with the dendrites of another neuron, because they're depolarized there, they release neurotransmitters onto the dendrites of another neuron, which can then depolarize that way. So it's kind of like a chain. What one neuron does to another neuron, that neuron can do to the next one. So we've talked about kind of what goes right in the nervous system. So what happens when action potentials are successful and we can release neurotransmitters onto our next neuron, and what the different lobes of the brain look like when they're healthy. But how do we talk about these things when something goes wrong with our nervous system? And this brings us into our next point of disorders and diseases of the nervous system. So I want to talk about two specific disorders that are mostly related to the neurobiology of disease. So there are a couple different categories of neurological disease. We have early childhood disorders, we have neurodegenerative diseases, which mostly affect patients that are older than the age of 50. We have psychiatric disorders, and then we also have things like this. So multiple sclerosis, I'm not sure if you've heard of this or having friends or family members with it, but it's essentially this chronic inflammatory condition that demyelinates our neurons. So remember when I was talking about how we really need this myelin because it's super important in making sure that our neurons work and can send these charges? What happens in multiple sclerosis is that the immune system thinks that the myelin is a foreign substance that it needs to kill. So it unleashes its B and T cells to essentially attack the myelin. So it's eating away at the myelin, and that leads to the death of the neurons, because if the neurons can't communicate with one another, they can't send each other nutrients, they can't send each other good information or like just things to help it keep itself alive, or neurotrophic factors. So they end up breaking down, which leads to these white matter lesions. If you look at the picture on the right, the arrows are pointing to these darker spots on a patient's CT scan, and that's where those lesions are. To make matters worse, the brain realizes that there's something wrong going on. So then it sends these glial cells to potentially help. But what the glial cells do is they don't actually support it. They essentially form this barrier around the lesion that prevents the regrowth of axons. So the nervous system isn't helping itself the way it should be, which essentially leads to this condition. And patients often see symptoms that look like dizziness, numbness, pain or tingling, and or just like half their face goes numb, or they can't pick up their left arm because their nerves can't innervate the muscles in their arm, so they can't pick it up because those nerves are dead. And that's how patients often come into the hospital. Unfortunately, there isn't a cure, and most patients only live between 5 and 15 years after the initial diagnosis before they unfortunately pass away. So it's really important that we look for a cure because there currently is not one. And interestingly, there is the highest rate of multiple sclerosis actually found in Canada. Another injury that we'll talk about is spinal cord injury. So multiple sclerosis doesn't really have a known cause. Interestingly, if you've ever had mono, almost 100% of patients with multiple sclerosis had mono previously. I'm not saying that if you've had mono, you're going to get multiple sclerosis, but most, if not all of the patients that have had multiple sclerosis were infected with mono or the mononucleosis virus before. And one theory is that the mononucleosis virus has a similar protein to the protein that's found on myelin. So the immune system mistakes the myelin for the the bad viral protein and essentially attacks it, which is not good. But it's just a fact. So for spinal cord injury, there is a very specific cause. Like you'll know what causes it. And the number one cause of spinal cord injury is actually motor vehicle accidents. And in second place is just like gunshot violence. So for spinal cord injury, essentially what happens is the spinal cord just becomes compressed. So maybe due to a car accident, maybe due to a gunshot wound. And this compression of the spinal cord is physically and mechanically injuring the neurons and triggers apoptosis. So the neurons essentially die, and then there's increased inflammation and glial scars. So it can't really fix itself, which is why most spinal cord injury patients have paralysis at some point in their body. Unfortunately, in most cases of patients that have spinal cord injury, they end up being paralyzed from the neck down. There's also no cure for this at present, so it's also important that we put research out into figuring out how we can cure this. And then I'll talk about two neurodegenerative diseases. So we have Alzheimer's disease, which is essentially it's caused by misfolded protein buildup and some environmental factors. We're not completely sure about the causes yet, but there are some things that could potentially contribute to it. And these prions, or these misfolded proteins, recruit other proteins that are misfolded. So that essentially builds up in these neurons and leads to their death. And most patients with Alzheimer's disease present very classically with memory problems, difficulty concentrating, they're very disoriented, and they have trouble recognizing their family. It's also important to note that there is not a cure for Alzheimer's yet. There are only symptomatic treatments that help alleviate the symptoms of Alzheimer's, but there isn't a cure yet. And the same goes for Parkinson's, although Parkinson's kind of affects a different region of the brain. So in Parkinson's disease, it's caused by a loss of these dopamine producing cells in our substantia nigra, which is kind of this deep subcortical nuclei in our brain. When we were looking at the lobes of the brain earlier, we were kind of looking kind of on the outside, but our substantia nigra is more deeper on the inside. So we lose these cells that innervate muscles and are responsible for motor movements. And because those motor movements are lost, patients often present with a resting tremor, slow movement, motor rigidity, and poor coordination. Again, these treatments are not a cure, but they do help alleviate the symptoms. And unfortunately, for both Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, patients often end up passing away between somewhere like 10 and 15 years, depending on when a diagnosis is received. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second, see if I have any questions in the chat. Let me see. Can giving drugs for Parkinson's disease, which help increase dopamine, also cause schizophrenia? So schizophrenia is potentially caused by multiple different factors, not just one root cause. So I'm not sure if maybe there's research out there that talks about giving dopamine like supplements to patients that have Parkinson's is helping, but I don't actually think even giving dopamine in an increased format, so like just like giving dopamine supplements, I actually don't even think that helps that much for patients with Parkinson's, because the cells themselves are becoming lost, so it's more about replacing those cells. But it's definitely a good point to bring up. And then someone else asks, can the compression of the spinal cord pressure the CSF? So when the spinal cord is essentially compressed, the CSF isn't able to deliver nutrients as it normally would. So it would potentially increase the pressure of the cerebrospinal fluid and cause more swelling. But again, not completely sure on that. So feel free to fact check me. Okay, so we've talked about some disorders and diseases, but what I want to highlight is that we know all of this information about all these diseases and what parts of the brain they affect and what goes wrong that results in these diseases for some of them, because of all the hard work of scientists that have poured their lives into researching all of these different things. So we have all this information thanks to really hardworking scientists who have spent a lot of time figuring out what the causes of these things are, designing their own experiments, getting funding to do those experiments and figure out what's going wrong, and helping create our treatments that we have today. and potentially one day leading to a cure. So here are some sample techniques that you can use in neuroscience and also outside of neuroscience, but I'll talk about it within the context of neuroscience for today. So here are some techniques that you can use to answer your own questions in neuroscience. So we have extracellular reporting. So I actually took these pictures from a neuroscience lab that I did in university. And what you can do here is examine the resting potential of crayfish muscle fibers. So I was talking about the resting membrane potential earlier and how it's pretty negative and it's influenced by when neurons become depolarized. So if you want to ask questions about potentially depolarization or muscle function, you could use extracellular reporting to do that, and you can also use it in different ways as well. You can also use fMRI, which I don't have personal experience working with, but from what I've learned, it essentially measures brain activity via detecting changes associated with blood flow. So if you see these red spots on this fMRI, that's essentially indicating where the patient has the most activity in their brain during that specific task or whatever they're doing. So if you want to figure out what area of the brain is most active during sleep, or when you're awake, or when you're eating food, or when you're studying for an exam, then you could use an fMRI to see what areas of the brain are more active during those specific things. Then there's also MRI. So as opposed to fMRI, so fMRI is our functional MRI, this is just a structural test. So it's creating detailed images of the structures and the organs within the body, but it's not telling you about, what's the most active, or, if I do this, will this be more active? It won't tell you anything like that, but it's going to tell you what those structures and organs look like. We also have a CT scan, which is commonly used by doctors and radiologists to help diagnose tumors and check for internal injuries. So essentially what a CT scan does is it compiles a series of X-ray images from different angles around the body, and it can help diagnose tumors, check for internal injuries, and more. So here are a couple of different research techniques that we have here. There are a ton more research techniques like this. This doesn't even begin to cover it really. This is just a really small list. But there are so many research techniques being used today to answer questions in neuroscience, to answer questions in other areas, and just to advance science. So if you're interested in science or neuroscience at all, we have an interactive optional homework assignment that you can do. So what we'd ask you to do is to do some background research on the research techniques and any other ones that you'd like, and design a simple experiment to solve this question. So the question is, a neuroscientist is collecting brain tissue from a mouse model of Alzheimer's disease and wants to discover which specific proteins may be responsible for neurodegeneration. So how are they going to go about doing this? What techniques should they use? How should they design their experiment? What should their sample size be? How should they essentially do this? So if you want to do this, if you want to participate in this, you can just type up your response on like a Google Doc or a Word doc, whatever works best for you. And then just message it to me on Slack and let me know that this is your homework submission. If you want to do this, I'll be giving feedback on your responses, and our most thorough response will receive a shout out at the either beginning of our next session or our Friday one, depending on how many submissions we receive. So it might take a little bit of time to grade or give feedback. But if you're interested in designing your own question in a format where it won't really cost you anything to do it, so it's like not for a grade or anything, but just for fun, so you can get some feedback and kind of practice your skills, we would definitely recommend that you take advantage of this. But if you don't want to, that's okay. This is not required. Okay, so if you like neuroscience and you also think that it's cool, there are actually a couple of different ways that you can get involved, and I'll be talking about one of them, which is Brain Bee. So Brain Bee is a neuroscience competition for high school students across the globe. So no matter where you are, there is most likely a Brain Bee where you are. And it's essentially a neuroscience academia competition. It's open to all high school students. You don't have to have any background in neuroscience. You, of course, need to study for the competition, but when you decide that you want to participate in Brain Bee before you get to the studying, you don't have to know anything about it, which makes it a really great experience. So I actually participated in Brain Bee in high school, and then at my university this year, we actually host Brain Bee ourselves, both the Hamilton local Brain Bee and the Canadian national Brain Bee. So I actually got to run the team of volunteers from my university, and everyone did a fantastic job. We were able to create a lot of informational resources for students, make the day fun, and have a guest speaker panel full of researchers and medical students and undergraduates that are interested in neuroscience, so the students could learn from them. Then if you look at the bottom right-hand picture, those are all the students that came to our Hamilton local brain bee. So it's awesome to see that high school students are interested in neuroscience and are coming out to participate. But yes, I would definitely encourage you, if you're interested in brain bee, definitely reach out. We have a channel on Slack dedicated to answering questions about brain bee, and I'll share the link with everybody afterwards as well. But if this is something you want to do, you're more than welcome to post a question in that chat and I'll help you get started. I usually help students figure out what they need to study, how they can go about registering for brain bees where they are. I am personally not familiar with registering for brain bee myself outside of the state of Massachusetts and then Hamilton, Ontario, but I will try my best to figure out where I can help you register, and then we can, work on study plans or things like that. So yeah, if you're interested, I would highly recommend it. It was a great experience. And our high school students in Hamilton this year also really enjoyed it as well. So I would definitely encourage you to take part if this is something that seems cool to you. So again, like I mentioned, it's available in every state and every country. It typically happens between the months of like February and March. So if you search for a brain bee near you, like for example, if you live in a certain province in Canada, you can just Google, like brain bees in that province. Within the provinces, there are actually multiple brain bees. So like there's a Hamilton brain bee, a Toronto brain bee. Where I grew up in the States, I grew up in Massachusetts, I think there was only 1 or 2 Massachusetts brain bees. If you are joining us from outside of the US and Canada, there might be just one countrywide brain bee. It depends on where you are. So just Google brain bees near me and just see what pops up for you, and then register when it's available. You probably won't be able to register right now because it's pretty early. Registration usually opens up in like September or October because the competition doesn't happen until February or March. And what you can also do is make a club at your school to prep. So other students have actually created clubs at their school before where they would meet up every week and study the content. They would pretend to be patients and diagnose themselves. They would study the book. They would study neuroanatomy, study patient diagnoses. And then I would recommend that if you plan on participating, setting aside at least 2, but ideally 3 months to study. So when I did it in high school, I set aside 3 months to study, and I found that that was enough time, and I was pretty focused. Okay, I'm going to see if there are any questions about brain bee in the chat that I can answer right now. Okay, so someone actually asks, what kind of careers can you get into after pursuing a major in neuroscience? So someone's thinking about it, but wants to know what you can actually do if you major in neuroscience down the road. So from what I know of majoring in neuroscience, some students plan on going to medical school. Some students want to pursue research, like their master's or their PhD or their postdoc, and stay in academia, either as a principal investigator of their own lab or as a teaching professor. Some students go into like clinical psychology. Some students go into like physical or occupational therapy, which only really requires like a master's. I haven't really seen students just go from like a 4-year undergrad neuroscience program directly into the workforce. I know it's definitely possible, but I typically don't see that. I think a lot of students end up doing their master's, PhD, or going to med school. But those are kind of some careers that you can get into after pursuing a major in neuroscience. I'm sure there's more, but those are the ones that I can think of right now. And then, okay, there's some other questions. Where is brain bee outside of the US? So if you participate in a brain bee outside of the US, it'll be in your own country. So I don't have specific information on that, but it'll be somewhere there. And then what do we exactly have to study to get into brain bee? So on your country's brain bee website, they should have a list of resources where you're supposed to study from, but it's usually just like 2 books. So I had studied from the Brain Facts book and also like study this other neuroanatomy book. And you should just know the book honestly inside and out, and then you'll most likely be fine. Someone asked if there a specialty that combines psychology and neuroscience. I would honestly say that psychology and neuroscience are pretty interrelated. So you could potentially do something like clinical psych or early childhood development or something more application-based. You could also do psychology research in neuroscience. I think research is something that neuroscience and psychology combine, but I'm not sure if there's a specific specialty or a major. And then someone else asks, do you have to be planning to major in neuroscience to participate in Brain Bee? Honestly, most of the kids that participate in Brain Bee don't actually end up majoring in neuroscience or psychology, neuroscience, behavior, or anything like that at all. They just do it because it's interesting and it's a good opportunity to compete in an academia competition in high school. So you don't have to be planning to major in it. It's a low commitment type of deal. Registration does not start in February. Registration will probably start between the months of September and November, if I had to guess. And then you participate individually. I actually know that there are some states in the US where you can like compete with a group of three. But what ends up happening is if you win the state brain bee, then you can go on to represent the country. So they only take one person. So I'm not sure why some schools do it in groups, but for the most part, it's individually. Would I say brain bees are impressive on college apps? I would say yes and no. If you went to participate but didn't really study, didn't really try, didn't really enjoy it, then you won't have much to write about on your college apps. Whereas if you went and you placed and you really enjoyed it and you networked with a professor there and then you got a place in their lab, you could really write about that to show that you're really interested in neuroscience or scientific research on your college application. So I would just say it depends on what you get out of the experience and what you make of it. Is there something similar for college students? Honestly, I wish that there was something similar for college students. What I've seen so far is just that like you can help volunteer with it, but I'm not sure if there are any similar opportunities. I will say some universities have like case study competitions. So I actually participated in a case study competition for like brain cancer last year. So that's a way to participate in neuroscience, kind of, that's not brain bee, but unfortunately they don't have this from what I've seen for college students. But if you want to start something up like that, that's a great idea. Okay, I think those were all the questions. Yeah, Jonathan?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that last question. Maybe there's not necessarily competitions that you can join, but there's always going to be research and symposiums that kind of give you that same sort of interaction with professors and whatnot. So I would say if you're going into college, look into some neuroscience labs.
Yeah, exactly. I would recommend if you're in high school and let's say you don't have anything to do over the summer, or if you're looking to kind of add some experience, I would recommend volunteering in a lab or joining a lab as like a research student. Any lab. It doesn't even have to be in neuroscience. It could be any lab that you're even remotely interested in. And that's great experience for if you want to do research in the future, or even if you don't. So yeah.
Yeah, let me let me add on to that. I actually did that. So during high school, I took dual enrollment classes, and then I had the opportunity to do research in chemistry. Usually when you take a class, how do you get to the lab work? In high school, yeah. So I mean, it really is about connecting with a professor who's able to take you on and teach you material. So for instance, I did a lab in general chemistry, but we had some topics that were organic chemistry. So the professor would just teach us on the side, just in our free time, about the material. And yeah, and then we just did some symposiums and stuff. If you have any questions about that, you can reach out to me on Slack.
Hmm. And then we're also going to be doing one of our workshops at the end of the program on how to get lab experience out of high school, how to write a good email or a good application so that a professor would be interested in taking you on as a student. So we'll be sharing that information as well. Okay, so I think that's good for questions. Okay, and then I wanted to wrap it up on a bit of a lighter note, less sciencey, but we'll talk about some optical illusions. So I'm sure some of you will have seen some of these before, but might fall for them again. So why do we fall for optical illusions? It's because sometimes when there's not enough information, our brain will try to fill in the gaps and kind of takes this path of least resistance and assumes that at baseline the world will probably make sense. So just assume that the world makes sense anyways. So if you look at these images right here on the left and on the right, you might notice that they're a little bit different, but for the most part, they look like at least semi-normal upside down faces. Can anyone tell what is potentially being optically eluded in this one? Someone says the eyes and mouth. Yeah, the smile. Yeah. So from where we're looking at it right now, they look pretty similar and kind of like normal faces. But when you rotate them, you actually notice that the face on the right is pretty scary and does not look like the way a face should look. But our brain kind of tricked us in the other one and kind of, it tricked us into thinking that it was like a normal looking face when it's actually not a normal looking face. That's because our brain is essentially just assuming that an upside down face should not look like the one on the right, but it should look like the one on the left. So it just assumes that that's what it's supposed to look like. And that's what we end up seeing, which is pretty interesting. If you look at this image here, it's actually just a picture, but what do you notice about it? It's moving. Yeah, it looks like it's spinning. And you don't have to look at it for too long because I don't want you to get dizzy. But yes, it looks like it's spinning, even though this is just a picture. Like I didn't put a video on the slide or anything. It is just an image. So it's essentially our brain tricking us into thinking that this is normally what moving things look like. So this picture on the screen must be moving as well, even when it's not. Another optical illusion is that when you look at this, you might either see two faces looking at each other, or you might see kind of like a vase. It depends on which way you look at it. Some people see the faces first. Some people see like the vase first. Depends. And then this is also a really interesting one. So in this one, there's actually no shadow at all. The shades of gray on the tiles are the same colors all throughout. Like there's no gray that's darker than any of the other tiles. And it's tricky because you're looking at it and you're like, Davina, that literally looks like a shadow. But it's actually not. If you Google like the shadow illusion or the shadow like checkerboard illusion, you can watch videos on how people will essentially just like pull up all the tiles and put them next to each other, and you can see that they're all the same color. But then when you put it on the board, they all look like different shades to create this shadow illusion, even when there's not a shadow there. So I think it's interesting. I myself don't personally know the specific neuroscience of how it works, but it does have to do with those general principles that I was talking about earlier. Okay, and then my last example for today was bringing up this iconic dress from an earlier time. So I want to say a couple years ago, or maybe a little bit longer than that, people saw this dress and everyone saw different colors. And they were like, how can you be seeing different colors when it is one dress? So I see white and gold or gold and white, but other people will see blue and black. So some people say black and blue, some people say white and gold. I don't think people are lying here. So we're all perceiving this differently, even though we're all looking at the same thing, which is kind of crazy. So yeah, I'm looking at the chat. Some people see white and gold, some people see blue and black. It honestly seems pretty evenly split. Yeah, blue and gold. Yeah, I don't think as a society or even as like the whole earth, I don't think we're ever gonna reach a consensus on this, and that's okay. Some people ask, some people are asking why you like see all of these different colors, or like why does it pop up, and why do some people see blue and black? Why do some people see white and gold? I honestly could not tell you. I honestly have no idea why people see it differently, but it's just a cool example of how our brains are perceiving this one item or this one thing differently, even though we're all looking at the same stimuli. So it just goes to show how our brains are kind of wired differently and are connected differently in different ways, and it's kind of what makes us unique. But yes, I'm sure this debate will go on forever. I don't think we'll ever reach a consensus, but yes. It's a fun example to bring up. Okay, so that was the end of my workshop for today. I hope you got something out of it and enjoyed it, even if you don't plan on majoring in neuroscience, or even if you're like, the brain's still like okay, but not super cool. I just hope you learned something new, and kind of enjoyed it. Maybe you're interested in brain B, but overall got something out of it. But yes, hopefully you enjoyed it. I really love teaching this workshop. Again, I'm super passionate about neuroscience. I love neuroscience and education, so teaching this workshop is great. But yeah, that's it for my workshop. And then I will share our first attendance poll now, and then we'll wait a couple minutes, and then our guest speaker will be here shortly. Okay, so I have shared our attendance poll. You can go ahead and answer that now. Again, if you don't see the poll, please send Rourke a message on Slack and he'll process that for you. And then the slides for my workshop, both in English, and we also have our Arabic version translated now, will be posted on Slack after the session is done. So yes, we'll give everyone a second to do that. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed the workshop and got something out of it. If you can't see the poll, make sure you message Rourke on Slack right now, so we know that you were at least trying to do the poll while it was up and running. Okay, I think most of the people have answered the poll, but I'll leave it up and running for another minute. For anyone asking what the correct answer is, it's glia. People are actually pretty split on this one. I'll wait a little bit because I see that some people haven't answered it yet, but then I'll share the results. It's actually pretty split, like almost 50-50. Okay, I'm gonna close the poll in 1 sec, so make sure you've responded if you haven't already. And nothing will happen to you if you respond incorrectly. It's just for participation. Okay, I think most, if not everyone, has answered the poll now. So I'm gonna go ahead and end it. Our guest speaker actually just let me know that he just got out of surgery. So maybe what we'll do is we'll take a 5 minute break to give him a few minutes just to like set up and get ready to join the call. And we'll resume in 5 minutes or so. So the time for me right now is 6 o'clock. So maybe we'll rejoin at 6:05 and then we'll get started with our guest speaker shadowing, okay? Yeah, so feel free to like stretch, grab some food, grab some water, and then we'll see you back in 5 minutes.
Hey, Davina, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Welcome. Thanks so much for coming to speak to us today, even though you just got out of surgery.
Yeah, sorry, we got a little slowed down today, a big case, and then I think the hospital firewall was trying to not let me join Zoom or something, but made it. Thanks for everyone's patience.
Yeah, no worries. Okay. So we'll go ahead and let you get started. If you have time for any questions, you can call on people that raise their hands on Zoom, or we'll open up the chat for you, but you feel free to go ahead and get started, okay?
Sounds good. Just let me know when I'm out of time, but I have a quick PowerPoint. Happy to take questions after, and we'll get started. I'm
Yeah,
going to go ahead
sounds
and share my screen. Let's see. All right, can everyone see my screen? I think people can see it. Can you see my screen, Davina?
Yes.
Sounds good. All right, everybody. Thanks for having me. My name is Austin Wynn. I'm going to talk a little bit about orthopedic surgery, my specialty, as well as some general background about applying to medical school and kind of how to get to where I'm at now in orthopedic surgery. And I hope that it can be helpful to everybody. So it's sort of some slides from previous talks I've given before, but a little bit more about orthopedics and residency and sort of where I'm at now. So a little bit about me. I'm from, Chicago, Illinois. That's where I grew up, about 35 minutes outside the city. I went to the University of Illinois Chicago for undergrad and continued on to medical school there at the University of Illinois College of Medicine. So that's where I'm at now. I'm at orthopedic surgery residency. We'll be graduating in 2028 at Houston Methodist Hospital, which is that photo there. So I'm in my second year now, and this is a 5-year program, so I have a few more to go. But things I like to do outside of medicine, I really enjoy playing sports and traveling and playing golf. And I also have a YouTube channel that I enjoy making videos for. And I think I've kind of shared that with y'all in the past. So uh, different types of videos like, USMLE prep and about residency. And it's been kind of tough lately with how many surgeries we've had and how busy it's been in training. But I'm definitely trying to keep some content going out. So, just to kind of frame our talk, just wanted to get you all thinking about why medicine. I know we generally have a pretty broad range in the audience, whether it's people that, are in high school or college, pre-med, or in med school already, and trying to figure things out. So I think it's really important to remember it's a long journey. Try to enjoy the process. That's a picture of me in Chicago when I was in medical school, and now this is a picture of me in residency. So it sort of comes around really quickly, and the days are long, but the years are short. So kind of enjoy every step of the process, whether it's high school, undergrad, med school, or whichever part you're at. So applying to med school, some updated statistics, since I think the majority of the audience are typically pre-meds or people interested in going to med school and maybe not sure exactly what specialty yet. So we'll kind of touch more on like orthopedic surgery and why I chose it and why I think it's no bias, the best specialty a little bit at the end. But in terms of medical school, this is the most recent data from last year's 2023 cycle. So MCAT means been going up kind of steadily over the years, about 511.9, 512 now. GPA means about 3.75 and science GPA of 3.68. So, of course, they kind of look at your science GPA different than your other GPA just because you can take, easier classes, kind of stat pad, but they want to see how you're doing on those core science classes, which makes sense why the non-science GPA is about 3.84. And the acceptance rate for med school has kind of ranged over the years, but it's somewhere between, this 35 to 40-ish% is kind of what the most recent literature says. Orthopedic surgery, on the other hand, so this is basically a residency that you choose after you graduate med school. It's what I'm doing now. So as I mentioned, it's 5 years. I'm on my second year, so it's 5 years after med school, and then you do a 1-year fellowship. So most of the job market these days in orthopedic surgery, you look at basically specializing in one joint, which for that 1-year fellowship, you'll do just that joint. So as a resident now, I'm on my spine rotation. That's also what I plan to do my fellowship in. I really enjoy it, which is why there's some pictures of scoliosis and spinal deformities there in the bottom right. And we can talk about that more later at the end if people have questions. But as a resident, we rotate through specialties. So right now I'm on spine, and then I'll go on sports. Then I do foot and ankle, hand, oncology, pediatrics, shoulder, elbow, and then joints, which is like hip and knee replacements. So you rotate through all those for every 2 months during the 5 years, and then you choose one to do a fellowship where you just do spine or shoulder, elbow, or joints for an entire year. And then when you go out into practice, you join a group of orthopedic surgeons, and I might be the spine guy, there's a hand guy, a hip guy, shoulder guy, and then you kind of just refer each other cases based on what they're fellowship trained in. But everyone sort of gets a little bit of everything in residency. As a specialty, it is one of the more competitive ones, about 60% match rate. So even about 40% of people that finish med school and apply to orthopedic surgery sometimes don't get a spot and have to redo a year. And so a lot of things kind of go into making it competitive. But USMLE scores, now that step one is pass fail. Step two is kind of the big one now that people focus on in terms of a benchmark for scores. But they also want you to do research, which is kind of the same for when you're applying to med school as well. Research looks good. So that's the same way as you get on to the next stage in life as well. You do something called away rotation. So as a fourth year med student, if you're really interested in, competitive specialties like orthopedics or plastics or otolaryngology, a lot of students would do away rotations where they rotate at the hospitals that they're interested in. So where I'm at now at Houston Methodist, I did do an away at, and then I think, and then clinical grades are also very important. So clinical grades, basically, when you're in med school, you go through these core rotations. So you'll rotate through just general surgery, medicine, family medicine, psychiatry, neurology. I'm probably missing a few, internal medicine, and OBGYN. And then you get graded on that. And that's something that also plays a big factor in the match and applying in orthopedic surgery. So where to start, kind of taking a step back from everything and, putting us, contextualizing it a little bit more. I think if you're at the stage where you're still deciding about medicine, or if you're here, you're probably like, I'm definitely going to go to medical school. Some things you can do at the high school level and at the college level is, shadowing and volunteering. I think shadowing is good because it gives you perspective into following, literally being a shadow to someone that's doing the job that you want. You get to see what their life is like and if you actually can see yourself doing it. But beyond just seeing yourself and convincing yourself that you want to go into medicine, shadowing is a very passive activity. You're not really doing anything; you're just watching. Whereas volunteering, like helping push patients to different beds or volunteering at the hospital in different ways or different capacities, it's more active. And I think that's something that I would recommend to many of you because that will actually give you something to talk about, an experience where you actually played a role in a team or helped patients with physical therapy or something like that. And then, I'd encourage everybody to explore, different experiences, just try to do things that you really enjoy, things that will make you stand out, things that are unique, and don't be afraid to step out of your comfort zone. And finally, research. I kind of harp on this a lot, and I know it can be very challenging to get research opportunities, especially as a high school student. Even at a college level, a lot of times labs or different researchers don't really want younger students, but I think finding mentorship is really important and finding someone that can really teach you along the way. I didn't do any research in high school, but I started when I got to college. And so you explore different topics and, the basics of research is really just applying the scientific method and, asking a question and trying to solve it with, clinical evidence or basic lab evidence. And there's so many different things that you can do for that. So that's a picture of me recently giving a spine project research day talk at my hospital for a grand rounds. And so, yeah, this is just another video that I filmed a couple years back now, but just going over my entire undergraduate schedule. It could be something helpful for people that are going into college or in college or thinking about classes from a high school level. So this kind of just went over my GPA, my classes, and kind of how I organized my schedule before I got into medical school. So kind of my college curriculum. And so when we kind of talk about study strategies, these are strategies that I'm still using even today as a resident, using it for anatomy and orthopedics, different types of classifications and treatment algorithms for different types of fractures. And I think it really starts, as early as college, where you can build a firm foundation. Anki is a system I use a lot. Many of you have probably heard of it, but it's like basically an interactive flashcard system that allows you to use spaced repetition to help you incorporate more active learning instead of just reading and writing notes. So I think getting involved and getting plugged in with something like that will really help you because if you use it in college, then you'll be prepared to use it when you take your MCATs. And then when you get to med school, pretty much every medical student has heard of Anki or are actively using it. It's a great study resource, especially when you have such a large breadth or volume of information. It helps kind of compartmentalize everything, because you know that as long as you do the assigned flashcards every day, then you're hitting, all the things that, you need to cover in terms of the content that you've already unlocked. And there's a lot of pre-made decks, so it's really sort of easy to get into Anki. And I've made a lot of different videos in the past about how to set it up in settings, but I can definitely take questions on that at the end. Then these are the videos, so you can check those out at some point. I've made videos for the MCAT and USMLE. And just some general advice and tips. I already talked about this earlier, but be open, explore different options. It doesn't have to be necessarily healthcare related, but go to travel, do, different volunteering experiences, whether that's, going abroad or doing something in your local food pantry or something near home. Just different types of opportunities that really make you stand out, and also to make an impact in the community. I think that's really important. And I think starting early is always, an advantage in anything. So if you're in college, trying to figure out what major you want to do, try to align it with, different prerequisites, and kind of plan out your whole 4 years of college, right when you get there with your counselor, just so you can figure out your goals and what you're looking for. Rely on your pre-med advisors. They've done this for a lot of different students, and they can be a really great resource for you. And try to get plugged in with research early, because it is a process that can take a long time to get onto papers or abstracts or present at conferences. So the earlier you get involved, the better. Here are some videos on AMCAS applications. That's sort of, not the topic of today's discussion, but it's definitely a process you'll have to go through when you apply to medical school. And so kind of getting back now on orthopedic surgery, I wanted to spend a little bit more time today just talking about where I'm at and my field, especially because now that I'm getting a little bit further away from high school, college, pre-med, and medical school, I'm starting to forget a little bit more of all the little intricacies, and orthopedic surgery is kind of my big passion now. So I really like orthopedics because, there's a start, a middle, and an end. So if you think about, someone that tears their ACL, you really see where they're at before. You see the middle of it, once you do the surgery and you put a new ACL, allograft in there, you're replacing their torn ACL with a new tendon or ligament there. So now that ligament is, intact. You kind of see them rehab after surgery. That's kind of the middle. And the end is, ultimately getting them back to return to sport, do the things they love to do. And then after that, you don't really need to see them or follow up with them anymore. You've already fixed their problem. Same thing with, your grandma that falls on the side of the street and she breaks her distal radius. She breaks it there. You put it in a splint, you hold it in place, and then you take them to surgery, put some plates and screws, you bring it back together. And then ultimately, once it's fixed, they can go back and doing all the activities they want to do and live their life. And I think that's what makes orthopedic surgery very rewarding. You generally have, younger or healthier patients, whether they're athletes or weekend warriors that have these kind of injuries, and you get to, see them get back to doing what they want to do. And generally the patients are very motivated because they want to go back to their quality of life. They want to go back to doing the things that they like. And I think that is very encouraging for them, because they can really, motivate themselves to do PT and actually follow through. Whereas, some other aspects of medicine that, treat more chronic conditions, it can be difficult, to tell someone they need to lose weight, or, they have diabetes or high blood pressure, things that you can't really cure. It's kind of a chronic thing, and they're on medications. And I just felt that orthopedics was more rewarding for me, because I kind of like to work with my hands. I like to fix things, and I really enjoyed that concept of it. The other thing about orthopedics is very objective. I think that it really fits my personality. There's no question when you look at an X-ray if something is broken or not. So you can really objectively show patients. They can actually see and understand that this is what's going on. The bone is broken, or it's dislocated, or the ligament is torn, and that's why they have pain, and that's why they can't do what they want to do. Whereas as a med student, there were times where I was trying to explain like coronary artery disease to a patient. Like, no, you have these plaques that are building up in your arteries, and now blood can't flow through. And if that plaque dislodges, it can, block a whole artery and cause like a heart attack. And they're just so confused because they can't see their arteries. They don't know the physiology and what's going on. But in orthopedics, I feel like that shared decision making is very nice, because I can show them their X-rays and they can tell what's going on. And then ultimately, you can impact someone's quality of life so much, because I never realized it until, working now and doing surgery, is that like people have such a poor quality of life when they can't, travel or play sports or go hiking or rock climbing, whatever they want to do because they're injured. And when you can give that back to them, it's very fulfilling. And of course, I think orthopedic surgery is a lot of fun. The picture on the middle there is me and one of my other residents. He was a fifth year, and we did this shoulder replacement surgery together the other day, and it was really fun. So you get a lot of good opportunities, like operating with your friends, fixing things, and it's just a fun time being in the operating room, I must say. And then, outside of doing orthopedic surgery, the other thing I've been really passionate about is, medical school education. So kind of stemming off the YouTube channel, I did, start my own company, and I'm here on the top left there. And then the other co-founder next to me is my friend that we went to college and high school together. He's now in anesthesia residency, but we sort of expanded. And so our team has grown quite large now. We're actually over 40 tutors, and we've worked with, almost 100 students now. So it's been really great. So if anyone really needs more specific hands-on, like one-on-one advice or tutoring, I would definitely recommend checking us out. And we're happy to answer any questions about that later as well. Mainly focusing on MCAT and USMLE tutoring, though. So that's kind of our main area of focus. So now I wanted to just sort of, before we wrap up, do a little bit more of like orthopedic surgery education, try to make it a little more interactive. I'm having a little bit of trouble accessing the chat from where I'm doing this because my Zoom is on like the browser Zoom because of the firewall. So I would just recommend if anyone, when we get to the part where I'm going to ask you all some questions, just turn on your microphones and just go ahead and chime in. So I'll start by doing a little bit of education. We're going to talk about hip fractures because it's one of the most common fractures, especially in the growing elderly population. Especially as people get older, they get more osteoporotic and weaker bones. And hip fractures are one of those things that generally get surgery because if you have a hip fracture, you're not going to be able to walk. It's never going to heal unless you put the pieces back together. And I thought this would be a great case presentation because, it really shows how objective orthopedic surgery is. And I think it's very fun. So here's a diagram of the hip. You have the femoral head and then you have the femoral neck. It attaches to something called the intertrochanteric region of the femur. And then the femur, of course, is much larger than this, but this is just the proximal or the end that's closer that attaches to your hip. And so when you have a hip fracture, it can be either, at the level of the femoral neck or the intertrochanteric region or the femoral head. We're going to focus on femoral neck fractures. Those are the ones that I think are easiest to see. And those can be classified as subcapital underneath the femoral head, transcervical, which is across the neck there, or basis cervical, is at the base of the neck. So everything in orthopedics has a classification, which makes it really easy because once you see an injury or an x-ray, you can classify it very objectively. And then you know that for every classification, there's a treatment. So the Guardian classification is what's used for femoral neck fractures. So you can see on the right here, that's kind of what you would think about on a femoral neck fracture, but there's so many different ways that these femoral necks break. So Guardian stage 1 is when there's a non-displaced incomplete fracture. So you can see that the fracture is not displaced. The hip still looks like it's intact, but in the fracture, it doesn't go all the way across. That's a stage 1. Stage 2 is when the fracture is complete. It goes all the way across, but it does not yet displace. Guardian stage 3, it's hard to tell here, but Guardian stage 3 is when the fracture is complete and it's partially displaced, but not fully displaced. So you can kind of see a little bit on this diagram that the hip, the angle here, the neck shaft angle is a little bit wider. So it shows it's a little bit displaced. And then Guardian stage 4 is when it's a complete fracture that is completely displaced. So just to talk a little bit about the treatment, Guardian stage 1 and 2, you can pin it with closed reduction percutaneous pinning, which means you don't have to do an incision and open up the patient. You actually can just send 3 screws up the femoral neck and hold it in place because it's not actually shifted, right? Once it's not shifted, you can actually just put those screws in and hold it in place, and that's a treatment. Versus 3s and 4s, because they are somewhat displaced, you can't just reduce it like that. You would have to do a hip replacement to treat it. So 1s and 2s get screws, 3s and 4s get hip replacements. So we'll make it interactive. We have someone here with a hip fracture. Does anyone want to attempt to read this x-ray? It's a right hip x-ray. And let me know what you think. Don't be shy.
Some people in the chat are saying either stage 1 or stage 3.
Okay, those are really good thoughts. Thank you for letting me know. So stage 1 would be non-displaced, right, and incomplete. Stage 3 would be a complete fracture that's partially displaced. So I think stage 3 or 4 is definitely more where we're leaning towards. You can see that the fracture is more subcapital, but it's definitely broken there at the level of the head and the neck, and it's displaced. And it might be hard to tell for many of us new learners who haven't maybe seen a lot of X-rays, but definitely this femoral shaft is very rotated. So this little guy here on the bottom is the lesser trochanter, and that's usually a posterior structure, so it shouldn't be showing this much. So it should be more internally rotated. But bottom line, it's definitely fractured all the way through, and it's displaced. So what do y'all think we should do to treat this patient? Do you think we can leave it this way without surgery? Do we need to do screws? Do we need to replace the whole hip? What do y'all think? And feel free to use the chat.
Most people in the chat are saying like hip replacement or screws, but mostly hip replacement.
Good. You got a smart group today. So hip replacement, because it's very hard to put screws across this fracture because there's hardly any bone in between and it's completely displaced. So if to get screws across, you'd have to basically try to reduce it in the perfect position. But in this situation, because it's displaced, this person got a hip replacement, as you can see on this image. And you can also see on the left side of the hip, you can see what it should normally look like, right? There's a femoral head, there's a neck and a shaft. This fracture here on the right side is clearly displaced. It's a complete fracture. So let's try another one. This one is more subtle, but there's definitely a hip fracture, and you can see the fracture line coming here and coming across the neck there. So let's give y'all some time to see what you think we can do about this one in terms of treatment. And the other thing I want
Is
you to
it
pay
stage
attention
2?
to, it's close. Actually, it's stage 1. So it's still non-displaced, which would be stage 1 or 2, but this one would be more of an incomplete fracture. And what you can tell is because the cortex is broken up here, but down here it's still intact. And something else you can appreciate here is that, like I mentioned before, that lesser trochanter is a posterior structure. So it's something that's behind the femur. So since this one's non-displaced, you can tell that you shouldn't be able to see it here. Versus over here, when it was rotated, you can see that whole bone. So that tells me that the entire shaft had rotated when they fractured it. Versus here, it's non-displaced, so you should expect to see the greater trochanter up here, but you shouldn't see that lesser trochanter down there. And so the treatment for this would be close reduction, percutaneous pinning by putting 3 screws across it, stabilizing that femoral neck. And then the patient, both of these procedures, either hip replacement or the screws, the most rewarding thing is that the patients are walking the next day or actually the same day after surgery. So if we do the surgery, it takes about an hour and 20 minutes. We fix their hip, either replace it or put screws in. And, this is someone that fell, broke their hip, 10 out of 10 pain. They can't walk. And now they're walking literally the afternoon after surgery because we stabilize it with titanium screws or titanium implants, and they're fully recovered. So I think that's incredibly rewarding to see someone come into the ER, can't walk, screaming in pain. You fix their hip, and then now they're walking. So that's pretty cool. So that's kind of all I had for y'all. Pretty quick, but I just want to wish everyone the best of luck, and I'm going to answer a bunch of questions. But check me out on YouTube if you want to stay connected or kind of follow my journey. I will try to be better, but residency's been really busy, so I haven't been filming too much. But you can also connect with me on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. I'm also Austin Wynn, M.D., and then Med School Partners LLC. The website link is there if anyone's interested in checking that out. And I think, I'm just happy to take questions now. I'm going to try to see if I can bounce back over back over on the chat over here. I can see the chat line now. Okay, so I see Good. I see a lot of interaction here. How often do these screws get removed? Great question. So actually, none of these screws, even like the hip replacement, obviously the hip replacement stays because the hip's completely replaced, but the screws all stay in place. Same with when people break their distal radiuses. We put plates and screws in. All that stuff can stay. It doesn't go off on the fire. It doesn't go off like in the airport. People always ask that. And unless the hardware is bothering you, you don't need to take them out. So the purpose of any hardware is to keep the bones in place so that your body can actually heal. And then afterward, you could take the hardware out, but it's really not necessary to do another surgery unless there was a reason for it, whether the patient is hurting or symptomatic from the hardware or something like that. But to go in and make an incision just to take out the hardware, it's really not necessary. So most people would just keep all their hardware. Let's see. Pin it. I'm seeing a lot of people getting the right answers from before. Try to scroll down here. Have you ever thought of applying for a BSMD program when you're applying to college? Yeah, I actually did. I applied to a couple. There's just not that many out there, actually. So BSMD program is probably 1% of the time that people will do it. And it's kind of nice to get a guaranteed seat, but it's really not necessary. I think most people go the traditional route. And oftentimes that can be a little bit easier because you have more time to, decide what you want to do, and you can like focus on your college classes and stuff, and you don't have to necessarily feel rushed. And I think the people that do get into those programs, they know really early that they want to do medicine, and so they have a lot of research or other opportunities that kind of make them stand out. But it's definitely not the only way to go. How do people do an MRI? Or let's see, I think the questions keep shifting because new ones keep coming in. Here we go. I think someone asked about MRIs, but you can definitely still get MRIs when you have hardware. You get something called a like metal reduction MRI, so it kind of like depresses the artifact that you get from the implants. Jonathan, do you have a question? I saw you raise your hand. You can just come off the microphone if you want to just.
Oh no, no, just a shameless plug. We're doing a BSMD mentorship program this year at MedStem Powered. So just for anybody that's interested, keep your eyes peeled out for that.
Sweet. What qualities do you think med schools look for in art essays? That's a really good question. Honestly, I think it's really easy to write like a cookie cutter kind of, what everyone can write, like why you want to be a doctor or like, had an injury that was treated or something like that. I think just kind of like focusing on something that makes you unique and making it, it doesn't even necessarily have to be about medicine, more about your life and why you want to be a doctor, but try to spin it in a way that kind of makes you more unique. I know that's not the most specific answer, but that's kind of the rule of thumb. And if you don't have like a very profound story, I would just, sort of go with a safer essay, something that would just, check the box, not necessarily going to give you any points, but you don't want to necessarily go for something that's way out there and then it kind of comes off a little strange or weird and then that can actually hurt you. So if you don't have something super unique, you kind of just go with something that's more standardized. What do I need to start learning surgery? Good question. Well, definitely need to know a lot of anatomy. And I think surgery is just like anything else in life. It's something that takes a lot of repetition. That's why we have to do a 5-year residency. Every surgery program does at least a 5-year residency, some are even longer. Neurosurgery, 7 years. But it takes a lot of practice and reps. It's kind of like learning how to play golf. You just have to do it a lot and work on your hand skills. So things that I'm still working on every day. A good question for stage 1 and 2. Is there any difference in the amount of screws put in? It's always 3 screws. We actually form sort of like, it's hard to tell in the x-rays, kind of looks like they're going one direction, but it's sort of like a tripod. And that's just been shown in the biomechanical studies and the cadaver labs to be biomechanically superior to 2 screws. And 4 screws didn't make any difference. And so it's just extra hardware and extra trauma to the bone. So 3 has been shown in the research to be better clinically and biomechanically. So that's actually a good segue into discussing like clinical research in orthopedics or just in any specialty. A lot of clinical orthopedics is looking at patient outcomes, recovery, return to sport time, the ability to ambulate, their patient reported outcomes of pain. And a lot of the things that we do, in medicine and in orthopedics as well, is all evidence-based, right? So the reason we do things is because there's actually evidence that shows 3 screws is biomechanically superior to 2 screws, but there's no benefit of adding a 4th screw, and that's been proven. Someone asked about women in orthopedics. This is a great question as well. I don't actually think it's more difficult for women to get in orthopedics. Orthopedics is actually a pretty male-dominated field, and so they're looking to get more women involved. And so I think that's actually been very helpful for a lot of my female co-residents or future med students that are females that we've mentored in the past. They've been definitely very successful lately. Not to say that it's harder for men to get in, but it has been a little bit better because they're trying to increase more diversity, which I think is a great thing. Orthopedics can be very grueling and hard. You're like pulling on bones and fractures in the ER and using a mallet, saw, hammers, and drills all the time. So I think a lot of women before were thinking like, oh, that's very laborious and I don't really want to do it. But I think it's becoming a much more inclusive specialty. And so I think anyone can do it. Some of the best orthopedic surgeons I've worked with, attendings, my program director is a woman. So you definitely wouldn't have many issues. And I think definitely don't let that affect you. In orthopedic surgery, do you have to learn how to read ultrasound, or is it the work of radiologists? So it's actually all x-rays, not ultrasounds. Ultrasound's more like when you're using probes to kind of put in lines or things underneath the skin. But I would say every orthopedic surgeon learns how to read their own x-rays because radiologists are human too. They make a lot of mistakes. And so I always read my own images and I look at the radiology read and confirm or like deny. And if there's ever any disagreements, I was just on call actually on Saturday, and there was something that I caught on the x-ray that the radiologist missed. So then I would just call them, we would discuss it together, and then he addended his read, and then we got the patient the right treatment that they needed. So it's definitely important, and it's something that you learn over time to kind of read your own x-rays. Thank you. Has there been any cases of misclassification of fractures? Yes, it definitely happens. I think especially like in residency, if you misclassify something, then you automatically think that they get XYZ treatment when they should get something else. It definitely happens, but luckily there's a lot of safeguards before patient goes into surgery where, you have your attending physicians that have been doing this for 10, 20, 30 years. And we kind of discuss all the plans together and make sure that the patients get the right treatment. But most of the time, orthopedics is pretty cut and dry, black and white. What gets surgery, what doesn't get surgery. There are some gray areas, but for the most part, I do like that objective thing about orthopedic surgeries. Let's see. You mentioned that you did research in undergrad. What was your research on? So my research in undergrad was nothing related to orthopedics. It was about Alzheimer's disease, and it was in a basic science lab where we basically gave these mice Alzheimer's. It sounds kind of inhumane, but then we would make them run through different mazes, and then we would test different treatments and cures for the mice that we gave Alzheimer's to see if their memory would get better and how they would remember to get out of the mazes or not. So that was what I did in undergrad. When applying to med school, is it important to emphasize the specialty you want to go into in your essay, or would it just be more general? I heard there was a stigma against people who went in not knowing. So definitely no. When you're applying to med school, it's really good to come in with an open mind. I think I knew I wanted to do surgery because I always loved working with my hands and I always wanted to be a surgeon, but you don't necessarily need to emphasize that. Actually, I think it's better for you to just be broad and explain that you want to treat patients, you want to take care of people, and ultimately you just want to be a physician. And then you can decide what specialty you want to go on after all your rotations and learning everything in med school, because it can come off a little bit too much if you are an undergrad and you're like writing an essay saying like you're going to be a plastic surgeon. You don't even, haven't gotten into med school yet. You don't know much about plastics, or you haven't been through all the different rotations. So it can be a little bit forward to just be like, I'm going to go do this because it's very competitive. And so I would just kind of be more broad and focus on treating patients and taking care of people and those qualities about being a doctor. Scrolling through. If anyone has questions they want to just ask out loud, just feel free to do that too. I'm going to keep kind of scrolling down here. Is it true that you need to have a lot of physical strength to become an orthopedic surgeon? Yeah, I would say, it definitely helps, but you don't have to be like super strong. I think a lot of it has to do with like the maneuvers. So we have some, like my buddy who's in my class, he like played football in college and he's like way bigger than me. But I think we both kind of do the same, same job. So it's definitely, you don't have to be like 6'5", 300 pounds, but knowing where to rotate the joints and like the anatomy is very helpful. So when a hip gets dislocated and I'm putting it back in the ER, it's less about force, but knowing like where to rotate the hip. So whether it's internal or external rotation, adducting or abducting it, it's more about knowing what you're doing and putting the force in the right direction than just being strong. Were you able to work during med school in order to sustain yourself, or must you dedicate all your time to schooling? So I started working when I was 16. I was like bussing tables at a restaurant and I was working as a cashier, and I worked every year since then. So a lot of the work I did after being a busboy was tutoring. So I tutored a lot for the ACT and SAT, did a lot of online and in-person tutoring. Then in college, I did some in-person online tutoring. And then at med school, I was also a tutor. And that kind of is what led me to start my own tutoring firm, because I just had so many years of experience working with students one-on-one, helping them with their essays and their scores and exams. And I really enjoyed working with students and helping them, reach their goals. So that was kind of like my main job. And so I think it's definitely possible to have that work-life balance. And I think working is important to sustain yourself as well. Med school is very expensive. And yes, orthopedic surgery is very bloody, but I think a lot of surgeries are. But the bone likes to bleed a lot, so it can be pretty gruesome. What were some programs, such experiences you had in high school that might have shaped your decision to go into medical school? So I think in high school, I played a lot of sports, and I think that's kind of the reason why I got interested in orthopedics. But for medicine in general, I had some family members that were doctors, and I got to shadow and work with them and see kind of their lifestyle growing up, and then working with patients. I thought, when I did my volunteering and I helped out in the hospital, I really enjoyed talking to people, getting to know patients, and then feeling like physicians really get to play a unique role in that they are facilitating the care, sort of leading a team, and you get to really help people sometimes in their most vulnerable situations. So I think that was kind of a big reason why I wanted to be a doctor in the first place. What do you think about gap years? Do you recommend them? It's a great question. Gap years are becoming more and more common, I think, in many different stages of education. So a lot of people take gap years between college and med school, which I think is good. A lot of times people need a break. It's been a long and tough undergrad. Also gives you time to study for your MCATs. It gives you time to make your application stronger, whether it's working another career, a job, or doing a study abroad or something like that. I think a lot of those things can help you stand out when you apply for med school. A lot of people are actually taking gap years in med school now too to do research years. So in orthopedics specifically, I know, and same with like plastics and ENT, a lot of people take a year off between their third and fourth year of med school to do research so that they can make their application stronger for the match. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I have a lot of friends and co-residents that did research years or did years off in between. I think as long as you're doing productive with it, then there's nothing wrong with it. But taking a year off because you failed an exam and then just passing that exam but needing an extra year doesn't sound as good as studying abroad or doing something like that. Davina, are you seeing any more questions on your end? I'm kind of just scrolling through here.
I don't think I'm seeing too many.
How are the other sessions so far today, Davina? Has it been busy?
Yeah, we had one in the morning.
Good. I want to be a surgeon, but I'm worried about finding a job because in my country, option for doctors to hire it stopped. Yeah, that's really challenging. I can only speak to the job market here in the States, which is pretty good for physicians. It depends on your specialty, but unfortunately, not knowing what country you're referring to and things like that, it's a little bit more difficult for me to comment on that. I think there's a question about computer science. I want to go to med school. Yeah, I think actually, being in something that's not just the traditional, bio major, even though that was my major, I think it does help you stand out. As long as you take your prerequisites, it actually can be more unique to come from a non-science specialty. I think actually for orthopedics specifically, a lot of the orthopedic doctors did their undergrad in like engineering or physics because like a lot of the fracture work and the angles and the bones and biomechanics is all biomedical engineering, and so a lot of them have that kind of mindset. So I think you can really make yourself unique by just deciding to major in something that you really are passionate about, something that you like. You're still going to take the same prereq classes, so it really doesn't matter what you major in. Work-life balance, yeah, it's challenging. I think being a resident is hard. We take like 24-hour calls every week. We don't get a day off after that. So you can go home and sleep if it's quiet, but a lot of times it can be really busy. So like on Saturday, I saw like 15 fractures and I didn't sleep at all. And then I was up for like 35 hours. It can be really busy. But you got to take care of patients. Take care of yourself is important too. So trying to find that balance. But most of the time, I usually get a few hours of sleep when I'm on call, and then I can still work the next day, which is good. But when I'm not on call, like today, we had surgery. I got in around 5:45 or 6 a.m. I usually go and see all my patients in the hospital, any ones that are still here from after surgery, or ones that are waiting for surgery, or any type of inpatients. I check on them. First surgery always starts at 7:30, and then we usually finish surgery depending on the flow of the day. Today we had one really big spine surgery, so that pretty much took about 8 or 9 hours. So we started around 8, and we didn't finish until I logged in here. So it was a pretty busy day, but technically I'm done now, so I could go home, and then I try to spend time with my wife, play sports, take care of things around the house, and catch up on any reading or case prep for the next day. We have another big surgery tomorrow, so I'll probably be doing some reading about that tonight, and probably studying and catching up on some of my Anki flashcards that I haven't done for like 3 days. Yeah, 35 hours straight, a lot of caffeine, a lot of Celsius, coffee. Luckily, it's not all the time that we stay up that much, but I got crushed this weekend. I'm very happy in my career choice. I think I talked about that in the talk, but I think orthopedics is no bias, best specialty. Residency is really hard, but that's kind of across the board because you're doing a lot of more scrunt work because you have to learn somehow. So whether that's seeing a lot of people in the ER, doing a lot of things where you're kind of the first responder for anything orthopedic. But once you finish residency, like most of our lead or attending physicians, they sort of supervise us as residents, and it's different. You have more responsibility when you're an attending, but also your lifestyle does get better because you're not doing like 30-hour shifts or anything like that. How many hours you should be working a week? It ranges. Technically, the ACGME mandates that you do not work more than 80 hours a week as a resident. Sometimes we do work a little more, sometimes we work less, so it does average out to about that, 80 to 100. Study hacks in undergrad and med school. I think Pomodoro interval is really helpful. So it kind of helps you stay focused for like an hour. Then you can reward yourself with like a 5 to 10 minute break. And then I think Anki flashcards are really good because it keeps you really organized. So I really like doing that. Do you often get paged or called into the hospital to look after your previous patients? Yeah, all the time. Anytime there's a complication or a patient that comes into the emergency department, we're definitely paged about it, and we come in and we take care of them. I think most surgical subspecialties do require pretty long hours. It doesn't necessarily need to be 30-hour shifts, 24s. You will work a lot in residency. I think whether you do surgery or not, you will work a lot. Surgeons generally do work more hours than non-surgical specialties because you are learning how to operate on people. So that does require more time than, being an internal medicine resident is something that you kind of learn those skills as a med student, how to like get a history and how to order medications. There's still a lot that they need to learn too, but they're not learning an entire new skill like how to do surgery, which I think it just takes more time. Is there any specialty sites for robotic surgery? Robotic surgery, yeah. I mean, we do robotic hip and knee replacements now. We do robotic spine surgery. There's a lot of machine learning, a lot of robotic technology advancements. I think that's one of the big reasons why I picked orthopedics too, is because you work a lot with different tech companies, reps, like all the people that bring like the hip implants and stuff. You get a great relationship with them. There's so much innovation. We're doing some virtual reality headset surgeries now where you actually wear like a headset. You can see like where you're placing the screws, making sure you're not hitting arteries or nerves or spinal cord, things like that. So navigation's pretty awesome. I see behind you many books. Tell me why you see that reading books is important. I am at the orthopedic surgery library at my hospital. None of these books are mine. I actually don't like reading that much. I never have, but I read out of obligation. So for like case prep or like whatever I had to read for school growing up, but I actually don't do any leisure reading. Can you be an athlete and go to medical school at the same time, or you'll not have? You definitely can. I think being an athlete makes you stand out a lot. A lot of my co-residents played sports in college. I didn't play sport in college, but I played a lot of sports during college. My roommate that started med school partners with me. He played tennis in college, so we played a lot of tennis together. He was a Division I tennis player. Still went to med school. Is in residency now, so definitely possible. Do you think getting paid outside the hospital affects your ability to maintain a work-life balance? So you only get paid if you're on call and you have the pager, luckily. So I think you do have that balance when you're not on call. But even if you're not on call, if something, they do know how to reach us in case, someone we operated on or something has an issue. But there's always someone on call covering. So even if you get called, you can have your partner cover for you if you're out of town or if you're doing something with your family. So you don't necessarily have to come in for everything. Yes, my buddy still plays tennis now. He's pretty good. Not professionally or anything, but he plays for fun in residency. And I play mostly golf these days. And I started playing pickleball instead of tennis because I realized that I'm a better pickleball player than I am a tennis player. So we started playing a lot of competitive pickleball this year in Houston because the weather is generally pretty good besides when there's hurricanes and stuff, but there's always a bunch of indoor courts. And so I played in 3 or 4 competitive tournaments this year. It's been really fun. All right. Any other questions? Davina, you see anything else on your end? Are we getting to
I don't think.
Yes, I live in Houston
Yeah.
Methodist Hospital, so I live here.
Oh, I see someone with their hand up. Deepali?
Yeah, Dipali, go ahead.
This is kind of like a simple question, but what are the replacement hips made out of?
It's usually titanium or stainless steel, and then there's a polyethylene, sort of like a cross-linked implant that kind of goes in between, and then that kind of helps with the load bearing, and then it can wear out over time. So sometimes we do need to replace that for people, but usually it takes about 20 to 30 years for that to wear out.
how do you prevent like rusting, or what if someone's like allergic to titanium or something like that?
So we haven't really seen any issues with allergies to it. We keep everything really clean. Everything is like sterilized, and so there's not really an issue with like rejecting the implant. It's not like that. So fortunately, we don't have to really worry about that. It sort of a lot of the implants will sort of ingrow into their bone as well, which is pretty neat. And actually, we have some implants over here. This is a one of the total knee implants, so you can kind of see what it looks like. So once we replace the knee joint, we cut the femur, we put titanium on there, and then this is the polyethylene insert in between. So that kind of bears um, bears a lot of the weight bearing surface in between. And then the tibia here also has a tray. So this basically allows them to move. So if you think about like really bad arthritis, they would have bone on bone and it would be really painful. So we cut off all that bone and then we place titanium in the femur, titanium down here on the tibia, and then this is the polyethylene insert. So this can come off. So that goes into the tibia. We punch it down. A lot of times we actually cement it in too for some people that have weaker bone. So we'll actually use cement and let it harden and cement it into their knee.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Does orthopedic branch into pediatrics, others? Yes, absolutely. So like I mentioned earlier, you do a 1-year fellowship. So you can do peds for a year and then just be a pediatric orthopedic surgeon. You can do oncology and be an orthopedic oncologist. You can do spine, like what I'm going to do, and be a spine surgeon. You can go into shoulder elbow and be a shoulder elbow specialist, or a hip and knee specialist, or a hand specialist. So if you go into orthopedic hand, you only do from like the elbow to the fingers. So it's really subspecialized. Just like spine, you just do from the cervical spine all the way down to the lumbar spine. We use real cement, that's for sure. How long does surgery take? Just depends on the surgery. Knees and hip replacements take about an hour and 30 minutes. It's like a special cement that's made specifically to be used in the body, correct? Not the same stuff used in the roadways, but pretty similar. I have been in about 10 to 11 hours surgeries that are pretty long. The one today was like 8 or 9 hours, so it's pretty long. Yeah, Methodist definitely has people shadowing. We have high school and college and med students all the time work with us. But that is, above my pay grade. I'm not sure how that process works. My teacher in high school worked as an X-ray tech. Mentioned surgeons might use JB something weld, fix broken bones. No, it's mostly plates and screws. But we do work a lot with X-ray technicians because we are taking a lot of X-rays in the operating room. We actually wear lead. We have our own lead. So on the slides there was a picture of me wearing my lead. It's got golf clubs on it, but we wear lead because the radiation can affect your organs. So we wear lead on our thyroids, cover our chests, and everything. Did you participate in shadowing programs in high school? Yeah, I shadowed some physicians, all primary care doctors, when I was in high school. Never didn't work with any surgeons, but really enjoy surgery when I was in med school and decided to go into it. So bone marrow transplants, not something that orthopedic surgeons do. It's generally something that oncologists do. But essentially, you give someone treatment to kill all their bone marrow cells within their bone, and then you transplant a hematopoietic stem cell. So a stem cell that can divide into a bunch of other bone marrow cells, and then you give it to them in their bone marrow after you kill all their native cells, and then that cell can grow and basically treat things like leukemia. What's your favorite surgery to do? I really like doing like decompressive surgeries in the spine and spine fusions, especially if people have really bad pain for like a disc herniation. You can do like a decompression and fusion or like a microdiscectomy. I think those are really fun. I also really do like fixing hip fractures. That's a really fun case. So neither of my parents are in medicine. My mom's a teacher, my dad's an accountant, but I do have a couple of uncles that were in emergency medicine, family care medicine. When starting out, was it difficult to stay awake and alert during surgery? Well, we usually do surgeries during the daytime, so I never really had an issue. But when you have like overnight cases, it can be tiring at times. I think your body just gets used to it and make sure that when you are off and you're not busy working and you're not up, then you try to catch up on sleep and get some regular sleep. So like on most days, like tonight, I'll still sleep, 6 to 8 hours, kind of get my usual amount of sleep. Yes, orthopedic trauma is another subspecialty. You can do a 1-year fellowship in trauma, and we work with trauma surgeons all the time, especially for big polytraumas like car accidents or people that fall off from heights. They usually have multiple fractures. So we do a lot of trauma work. Do you think the use of AI would help in your profession? Absolutely. I think a lot of people are using it, especially machine learning, to help with like finding good evidence-based research. And there's a lot of AI now about like fractures, and yeah, it's pretty cool because a lot of AI can actually read fractures faster than the radiologist, and it can catch a lot of things that you may have missed. So.
Maybe we'll do like one more question and then we can redirect anyone that has questions to like your Instagram or your email.
Yeah, I think YouTube or Instagram would probably be the fastest ways to reach me, or LinkedIn. But sure, I can go ahead and read one more question.
Perfect.
What skills did you start to improve on in high school to get the surgery track? I don't think there's anything you need to do, particularly in high school. I think just continue working hard, do well in your classes, get into med school first, or college, and then med school ultimately. But I think I've always, just because I played a lot of sports, and my family, they started like a sewing company when I was younger, when they came and immigrated from Vietnam. So I used to help them with a lot of folding and sewing. So I think I've always been good with my hands. I play piano, guitar, a lot of instruments, and so I think just having that tactile hand skills definitely helps when you're doing something like surgery and you're near vessels and nerves and tendons. You do have to have pretty good hands to be a surgeon. All right, everybody. Thanks a lot for your time. I think we're just about an hour, so thanks for all the great questions and for being so interactive. And Davina, let me know if you need anything else from me, but feel free to reach out if you ever need it.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for coming in. People saying thank you in the chat, but something we want to do is give you a little virtual round of applause on Zoom. So if people get that little tap button, that would be great. Just to say thank you
Yeah,
for
thank you.
listening to us
Appreciate
right after you had surgery too. We really, really appreciate it. And hope you have a great rest of your week and that all of your future cases go well too.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much, and good luck with the rest of the talks, the rest of the week, and the rest of the summer session. And let me know if you need anything, and you have all my contact info.
Yes, will do. Thank you so much again.
Yep. See you later.
Bye. Also, for anyone that needed the attendance poll, I released it. So as soon as you have answered that and you saw it successfully and make sure your response went through and you have to head out, you're more than welcome to. Thanks for sticking around with us for a couple extra minutes today so we can get some extra questions in. And we'll see you on Wednesday. If you have any questions, feel free to message us on Slack. We'll see you on Wednesday, same time. We'll post the Zoom links there. And we hope you're enjoying the program. We'll see you then. Bye, everyone.
Can I ask you something, please?
Thank you.
I have to head out, but if you want to message me on Slack, I can probably respond in the next like 30
Don't worry. It's a simple question.
Oh, actually, I can't hear you. Okay, yeah. If you have a question, feel free to message me on Slack. I'll get back to you super soon.